He thought his mistress would replace her. He was wrong. When Luca took his mistress to their favorite restaurant, he never imagined his wife Elena was watching from the VIP section, sipping champagne and plotting her revenge. What followed wasn't just a divorce. It was a demolition. From boardroom takedowns to leaked scandals, Elena dismantled his empire piece by piece. And when the ashes settled, only one phoenix would rise. The restaurant was a temple of opulence, a place where the elite came to see and be seen. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen constellations above, their light refracting off the polished silver and fine china. The low hum of conversation mixed with the soft clinking of glasses, a symphony of wealth and privilege. And in the VIP section, shrouded in the golden glow of exclusivity, sat Elena Moretti. She was a vision of quiet power, her dark hair swept into an elegant chignon, her emerald green dress hugging her curves with understated grace. A half-empty glass of red wine sat before her, its deep crimson hue mirroring the fire simmering in her chest. Her fingers traced the rim of the glass absently, her gaze fixed on a table across the room. There, laughing like a man without a care in the world, was her husband, Luca Moretti. CEO, charmer, philanderer. And beside him, hanging on to his every word, was Sophia Loren, his mistress. Elena's lips curled into a slow, icy smile. She had known about Sophia for months. The late-night business meetings, the sudden weekend trips, the way Luca's phone was always angled just out of her sight. She had watched the signs, pieced together the evidence like a detective building a case. But knowing was one thing. Seeing was another. Luca leaned in, whispering something that made Sophia giggle, her manicured fingers brushing against his wrist. The way he looked at her, like she was something precious, something worthy of adoration, sent a sharp pang through Elena's ribs. How many years had she spent as the invisible force behind his success? How many nights had she stayed awake drafting contracts, smoothing over his mistakes, whispering strategies into his ear before high-stakes meetings? She had been the foundation of his empire, the silent architect of his rise. And yet here he was, treating her like yesterday's news while he paraded his mistress in public like a prize. A waiter approached her table, his posture deferential. "Another glass, Mrs. Moretti?" She didn't look away from Luca. "No. Bring me the check." The waiter hesitated. "But you've barely touched your meal." "I've lost my appetite." Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Daniel Carter, Luca's former rival, the only man who had ever truly seen her worth. "He's finalizing her promotion tomorrow. VP of Acquisitions." Elena's fingers tightened around her phone. So that was the game. Sophia wasn't just the mistress. She was the false successor, the woman Luca was grooming to replace Elena in every way. A slow breath escaped her lips. Fine. If Luca wanted to play this game, she would remind him why he had never been the smartest person in the room. She signaled the waiter again. "Actually, send a bottle of Dom Perignon to that table." She nodded toward Luca and Sophia. "The 1996 vintage." The waiter's brows lifted. A gift. Elena's smile was lethal. A reminder. 1996. The year she and Luca had married. The year she had given up her own dreams to build his. The waiter delivered the bottle with a flourish. Luca's initial smirk faltered when he saw the label. His head snapped up, eyes scanning the restaurant. The first move had been made. And the war had just begun. The champagne bottle stood like an uninvited guest at Luca's table, its gold foil label catching the candlelight with mocking brilliance. Dom Perignon 1996. The year his life had supposedly begun. The year he'd married Elena in that sun-drenched Sicilian chapel surrounded by orange blossoms and empty promises. Now its presence felt like a blade between his ribs, twisting with every bubble that rose in the untouched glass. Across the table, Sophia giggled at something the waiter said, her French-tipped fingers playing with the stem of her wineglass, completely oblivious to the silent war being waged just 20 feet away in the velvet-draped VIP section. Luca's palms had gone clammy the moment the sommelier presented the bottle with that carefully rehearsed line, "Compliments of an admirer." He'd known instantly, with that primal instinct that still recognized his wife's moves even after years of taking her for granted. His gaze kept darting toward the shadowed VIP alcove where occasional flashes of emerald silk betrayed Elena's presence. She'd chosen that color deliberately, The exact shade of the dress she'd worn when he'd proposed, when he'd knelt in the rain outside her tiny startup office and sworn his devotion between kisses. Now it served as her battle standard, a visual reminder of everything he'd betrayed. Sophia's manicured hand closed over his wrist, her acrylic nails biting just slightly into his skin. "Earth to Luca," she pouted, her breath sweet with the expensive Chardonnay he'd ordered to avoid opening Elena's poisoned gift. "You've been distracted all night." Her lower lip jutted in that practiced way that usually made him cave to her whims, but tonight it only made his stomach churn. At 26, Sophia possessed all the subtlety of a firework, beautiful, loud, and ultimately fleeting. It had been thrilling at first, this affair with his junior acquisitions manager, like stealing candy when you already owned the store. But now, seeing Elena's silent observation from across the room, he realized with dawning horror that he might have underestimated the cost. The restaurant's pianist chose that moment to launch into a familiar melody, La Vie en Rose, the very version Luca had played during their first dance as husband and wife. Sophia rolled her eyes dramatically. "Ugh, this again? Don't these places know any modern music?" She couldn't have crafted a more perfect contrast to Elena if she'd tried. Where his wife had always appreciated the layered complexities of jazz and classical, Sophia's playlists consisted of auto-tuned pop and club remixes. The realization struck him with sudden, brutal clarity. He traded a vintage Bordeaux for grape juice. His phone buzzed against the white tablecloth. A text from his CFO. "Board package finalized. Sophia's VP appointment documents on page 17 as discussed." The words blurred before his eyes. This promotion had been Sophia's price for continuing their arrangement, her ticket into the C-suite, and though he'd never admit it, his way of justifying the affair to himself. If she was truly talented enough to be VP, then this wasn't just about sex, was it? It was about recognizing merit. The lie had almost convinced even him. Until tonight. Until Elena's champagne. Until the music. Until the way his skin prickled under the weight of his wife's unseen gaze. He reached for the Dom Perignon with suddenly steady hands. The cork came free with a muted pop that sounded like a gunshot to his ears. Sophia clapped her hands together like a delighted child as he poured 2 glasses, the bubbles fizzing like the acid in his stomach. "I knew you'd come around," she purred, taking an unrefined gulp that made his jaw tighten. The wine tasted like ashes on his tongue, each sip carrying the ghosts of better men he might have been. Across the restaurant, a waiter approached the VIP alcove with a silver tray bearing a single espresso. Luca watched transfixed as a slender hand emerged from the shadows to accept it, Elena's signature move, her preference for bitter over sweet extending beyond just beverages. The hand paused, turning slightly so the overhead light caught on her wedding band, the diamond he'd chosen winking at him like a dare. Then, with deliberate slowness, the fingers curled inward, leaving only the middle one extended for a heartbeat before disappearing back into the shadows. Sophia choked on her wine. "Did that bitch just flip you off?" Her voice carried just enough to turn heads at nearby tables. Luca felt the blood drain from his face. This was exactly why he'd never taken Sophia anywhere important. Her lack of decorum, her inability to read a room. Elena would have never. The thought trailed off, bitter and useless. Elena would have never made a scene because Elena had never needed to. Her power had always been in the silent moments, the raised eyebrows, the perfectly timed exits. She commanded rooms without raising her voice, while Sophia compensated for her insecurities with volume and vulgarity. His phone buzzed again. Unknown number. A video attachment loaded slowly, revealing security footage from last Thursday night, the evening he'd told Elena he'd be working late. There he was, clear as day, pressing Sophia against the photocopier in the empty office, her skirt hiked up around her thighs as she moaned about how powerful he was. The timestamp in the corner matched exactly with a text he'd sent Elena about reviewing quarterly reports. Another message followed. "Promote her tomorrow. I dare you." The screen cracked under the pressure of his grip. Sophia reached for his arm. "Babe, what's wrong? You're shaking." He jerked away with enough force to slosh wine onto the tablecloth, the spreading stain looking uncomfortably like blood. In the VIP section, a chair scraped back. The emerald silk dress emerged from the shadows, Elena's silhouette backlit by the emergency exit sign as she gathered her clutch with deliberate calm. She didn't look toward their table. Didn't need to. Every measured step toward the door was a performance, a masterclass in how to leave with dignity while your world burned behind you. The waiter appeared at his elbow with the check. The lady in the VIP section asked that this be given to you directly, sir. Luca opened the leather folio with numb fingers. Beneath the itemized receipt lay a single photograph, a sonogram image from 8 years ago, the date stamp still visible in the corner. Their last pregnancy. The one that had ended in a hospital room he'd left early to take a business call. The same night he'd first slept with his then assistant. Elena's elegant script graced the bottom. Some debts can't be paid with money. Sophia snatched the photo, her nose wrinkling. EW, what is this? She flipped it over, then back again, comprehension dawning slowly. Wait, was she? Her gaze darted between the photo and Luca's ashen face. Oh my God, you didn't tell me she'd been pregnant. The restaurant seemed to tilt on its axis. All around them, the clink of silverware and murmur of conversation continued, oblivious to the nuclear bomb that had just detonated in their midst. Luca became acutely aware of every detail, the too sweet perfume Sophia had doused herself in, the way her overfilled lips pursed in performative sympathy, the sticky residue of the wine on his fingers. He'd spent years convincing himself that Elena didn't understand him, that she'd become cold and distant, that she'd driven him to seek comfort elsewhere. Now he saw the truth with brutal clarity. The waiter cleared his throat. Will there be anything else, sir? Luca reached for the champagne bottle with suddenly steady hands. Another round, he heard himself say. And keep them coming. As the waiter retreated, Sophia leaned in, her whisper carrying across the table. Are you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. Luca drained his glass in one burning swallow. I have, he said, watching Elena's silhouette disappear through the restaurant's doors. Wine. The storm outside Daniel Carter's penthouse mirrored the tempest in Elena's chest. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, distorting the city lights into watery streaks of gold and crimson, like tears smearing mascara down the face of the night. She stood motionless before the glass, her fingers tracing the rim of a whiskey tumbler she had no intention of drinking from. The ice had long since melted, diluting the amber liquid into something pale and weak, unlike the fury burning through her veins. Across the room, Daniel observed her with the quiet intensity of a predator studying its prey, though which of them filled which role remained deliciously ambiguous. His tailored suit clung to broad shoulders, the top button undone to reveal the faint silver scars along his collarbone, reminders of battles fought long before Elena had entered his life. The silence between them stretched taut, charged with everything they couldn't, say aloud. You should have let me destroy him completely today. Daniel's voice cut through the quiet like a blade through silk, smooth but edged with menace. He swirled his own untouched drink, the crystal catching the dim light. One call to the SEC about those offshore accounts, and Luca would be spending the night in a holding cell instead of licking his wounds in that overpriced penthouse. Elena's reflection smiled faintly in the rain-streaked glass. Prison would be a mercy. She turned slowly, the emerald silk of her dress whispering against her thighs. The fabric was the exact shade of the olives that grew on her grandmother's estate in Tuscany, a childhood memory she'd buried beneath years of boardroom battles and marital compromises. I want him to feel it, Daniel. Every betrayal. Every lie. I wanted to eat him alive the way it did me. Her nails, painted a venomous crimson, tapped against the tumbler. Besides, incarceration would make him sympathetic. And Luca Moretti deserves no such kindness. Daniel exhaled through his nose, a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Christ, Elena. Remind me never to cross you. He rose from the sofa with predatory grace, closing the distance between them. The scent of his cologne, sandalwood and something darker like gunmetal after a shot, wrapped around her as he plucked the glass from her hand. His fingers brushed hers, deliberate and lingering. But you're holding back. Why? The question hung between them, heavier than the humidity pressing against the windows. Elena studied the man who had been Luca's fiercest rival long before he'd become her. What? Ally? Confidant? The line had blurred in recent months, fraying at the edges like a well-worn contract. He could lie, of course. Claim strategic patience or legal caution. But the truth slithered out before she could stop it. Because I need him to watch. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I need him to see everything he threw away rise up without him. Daniel's thumb traced the curve of her jaw, calloused skin catching on the delicate hairs at her nape. Including this? His breath warmed her lips close enough to taste. Elena didn't flinch. Especially this. The knock at the door shattered the moment like a bullet through glass. Daniel stepped back, his expression shuddering as Elena smoothed non-existent wrinkles from her dress. The housekeeper entered with a silver tray, upon which sat a single envelope. No return address. No postmark. Just Elena's name written in a looping script that made her stomach clench. Daniel intercepted it with a frown. "You're not opening that. I wasn't aware I required permission." She plucked it from his grasp, slicing the seal with her thumbnail. The contents spilled onto the side table. A photograph of her and Daniel entering this very building last night, their bodies angled toward each other in intimate conversation. But it was the second image that stole her breath. A grainy surveillance still of a younger Luca, his arms slung around a pregnant Elena's shoulders outside a maternity clinic. The date stamp in the corner, 8 years ago, 2 days before the miscarriage. A note fluttered to the floor. "Some secrets aren't yours to keep." Daniel snatched up the photo, his jaw tightening. Luca wouldn't be this stupid. "No," Elena agreed, her voice eerily calm even as her pulse hammered against her ribs. "But Sophia would." She crossed to the window, pressing her palm against the cold glass. The storm had intensified, rain now falling in diagonal sheets that blurred the world beyond. Somewhere out there, Luca was drowning in the consequences of his choices. And Elena? She was just getting started. The elevator doors slid shut behind Luca with a whisper of finality, sealing him in a tomb of his own making. The mirrored walls reflected a man he barely recognized, tie askew, pupils dilated with panic, the divorce papers crumpled in his fist like a failed plea bargain. Sophia's shrill accusations still rang in his ears. "You promised me VP. You promised no one would find out." As if their entire relationship hadn't been built on the thrill of secrecy. The elevator music, some insipid piano rendition of a pop song, grated against his nerves. Or maybe it was the way the melody kept time with the notifications pinging from his phone. Market alert. Moretti Holdings halted pending news. Down 18% pre-market. CFO, board emergency meeting moved to 8 a.m. Carter chairing. Unknown, enjoy the champagne, asshole. The last message included an attachment. A video of Sophia, her face flushed with pleasure, gusacing his name in his office last Thursday. The timestamp matched exactly with a text he'd sent Elena claiming he was at a charity dinner. His stomach lurched. How many more of these did she have? How long had she been watching? The elevator stopped on the 32nd floor. The doors parted. And there stood Daniel Carter, looking like vengeance personified in a charcoal suit that cost more than Sophia's annual salary. Luca's muscles locked. Of all the people, Daniel stepped inside, his cologne, that same fucking sandalwood and gunmetal blend Elena had once bought him for Christmas, filling the cramped space. Neither spoke as the elevator resumed its descent. The silence stretched taut as a noose. Daniel broke it first. "Heard you had a rough morning." Luca's laugh scraped his throat raw. "Come to gloat. To warn you." Daniel turned fully toward him, his blue eyes glacial. "You think this was about the mistress? The embezzlement?" He shook his head, almost pitying. "She's just getting started, Luca." The elevator dinged. Garage level. Daniel stepped out, then glanced back over his shoulder. For what it's worth, she deserved better. The doors closed on Luca's roar of fury. Rain sheeted against the windows of Elena's new office, a sleek, half-finished space in the financial district's tallest tower. The scent of fresh paint and sawdust clung to the air, the promise of something untainted. Daniel watched from the doorway as she ran her fingers along the raw edge of a drywall seam, her engagement ring conspicuously absent. "You bought the building under a shell company," he observed. Elena didn't turn. Luca never paid attention to the details. Daniel moved closer, his reflection joining hers in the night-blackened glass. "Why show me this now?" The question hung between them, heavier than the humidity. Elena turned slowly, her green eyes gleaming in the half-light. "Because I need to know if you're really with me." Daniel closed the distance in 3 strides. His hand cupped her cheek, rough with the scars of old battles. "I've always been with you." For the first time in years, Elena let herself lean into the touch. Outside, the storm raged on. The penthouse smelled of stale champagne and wasted ambition, the lingering scent of Luca's cologne clinging to the curtains like a ghost Sophia couldn't exorcise. She paced the length of the living room, her stilettos clicking against marble floors polished to a mirror shine, the same floors where she'd once made love to Luca after his birthday gala, her back pressed against the cold stone as he whispered promises of power and prestige in her ear. Now the space felt hollow, the only evidence of their affair being the shattered crystal flute near the fireplace and the steadily growing collection of news alerts flashing across the silent television screen. Moretti Holdings stock plummets 22%. Board votes to suspend Luca Moretti pending investigation. Daniel Carter named interim CEO. Each headline was a hammer blow to the future she'd been promised. The carefully constructed fantasy of stepping into Elena Moretti's designer shoes crumbling like a sandcastle before the tide. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her mother, no doubt having conniptions over the family name being dragged through every financial blog and gossip column from Wall Street to Knightsbridge. Sophia ignored it, just as she'd ignored the 17 missed calls from Luca, the coward having gone radio silent the moment the board turned on him, leaving her to weather the storm of humiliation alone. She stalked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing her palms against the cool glass as she stared down at the ant-like pedestrians 60 stories below, their oblivious lives continuing while hers imploded. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Luca had painted her such pretty pictures of the future, his hands tracing the outline of her corporate ascent as easily as he traced the curves of her body. The VP title was meant to be just the beginning, a stepping stone to Elena's seat at the table, Elena's connections, Elena's entire goddamn life. Instead, she'd become a cautionary tale, her carefully cultivated reputation reduced to tabloid fodder and boardroom whispers. Another ambitious girl who'd gambled on the wrong married man and lost spectacularly. The key turned in the penthouse lock with a soft snick that froze the breath in Sophia's lungs. She spun toward the door, expecting Luca's haggard face and rumpled Armani suit, ready to unleash months of pent-up fury at being abandoned to the wolves. But the figure silhouetted in the doorway wasn't Luca. It was a woman, tall and lean as a razor blade, her sleek black bob sharp enough to draw blood. She wore a tailored pantsuit the color of dried blood, the fabric whispering of private fittings on Seville Row, and her smile when she stepped into the light was all teeth and no warmth. "Meera Carter," the woman said by way of introduction, closing the door behind her with a Louboutin-clad foot. "Daniel's other problem." Sophia's manicured hand flew to her chest, her pulse rabbiting beneath her fingertips as she took an involuntary step back, her heels catching on the Persian rug Luca had imported from Istanbul. "What the hell are you doing here? This is private property." Myra's laugh cut through her protest like a scalpel, cold and precise. "Spare me the indignant act, darling. We both know you've got exactly 3 options right now." She counted them off on fingers adorned with vintage rings that probably cost more than Sophia's entire wardrobe. 1. Crawl back to whatever gold digger academy spat you out and hope your daddy's connections can salvage your reputation. 2. Throw yourself on Luca's non-existent mercy and pray he doesn't feed you to the SE wolves to save his own skin. A deliberate pause, her dark eyes glinting with something dangerous. Or 3. You help me burn Elena Moretti to the ground. Sophia's breath hitched, the words slithering into her ears like smoke. "Why would you?" "Because Daniel chose her," Meera interrupted, her voice dripping venom as she advanced, her perfume, something dark and spicy like cinnamon and gunpowder, wrapping around Sophia like a noose. "Just like Luca did. Just like every powerful man always does when presented with a shiny new toy." Her crimson lips twisted into something too bitter to be called a smile. "But we're the women they use. The ones they discard when someone more convenient comes along." A flicker of movement caught Sophia's eye. Myra's phone screen illuminated with a paused video showing Elena and Daniel in what looked like a private elevator, his hands tangled in her hair, her back arched against the mirrored wall. The timestamp read yesterday. Myra's thumb hovered over the play button, her gaze locked onto Sophia's face like a predator scenting weakness. Interested now? The safe house smelled of gun oil and jasmine tea, an unsettling combination that set Elena's teeth on edge as she watched Daniel prowl the length of the bulletproof windows, his back to her as he scrolled through security footage on his tablet. The blue glow of the screen highlighted the tension in his shoulders, the rigid set of his jaw, And she didn't need to see the images to know what had put that storm cloud expression on his face. "Meera's in the city," he confirmed without turning, his voice rougher than usual, as if the words had been dragged over gravel. Elena didn't flinch, didn't betray by so much as a flicker of eyelash that she'd expected this development. Daniel's estranged sister had always been the wild card in their deck, the shadowy figure lurking at the edges of every strategy session. The Carter siblings' feud was the stuff of Wall Street legend. Meera had nearly bankrupted Daniel's first hedge fund before disappearing with a sizable chunk of his investors' money and a Rolodex of contacts that still gave Interpol headaches. She took a deliberate sip of tea, the delicate porcelain cup absurdly fragile in her hands compared to the weight of their conversation. "She contacted Sophia," Elena observed, watching the way Daniel's shoulders tensed further at the mention of his sister's name. "They'll go after the Dubai deal." Daniel finally turned, the raw fury in his eyes sending an electric thrill down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. "Let them try." Elena set down her cup with exaggerated care, the quiet click of china against glass sounding like a gun cocking in the tense silence. "You're underestimating her. Meera didn't just steal from you, she studied you. She knows how you think, how you operate." The corner of Daniel's mouth lifted in something too sharp to be called a smile. "And you don't." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, a gauntlet thrown between them that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the unspoken thing that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. They stared at each other across the space that had once been strictly professional, the air between them charged with the memory of 1,000 stolen glances and accidental touches. Elena remembered the first time they'd met, a hostile takeover attempt where she'd outmaneuvered him at every turn, her quiet brilliance eclipsing his aggressive tactics. The respect in his eyes afterward had been the first genuine compliment she'd received in years, a stark contrast to Luca's performative praise that always came with strings attached. Now, with Luca's empire crumbling around them and Meera's return threatening to upend their carefully laid plans, that professional respect had deepened into something far more dangerous, something that made her pulse stutter when he looked at her like that. Elena broke the silence first, her voice steady despite the storm inside her chest. "We need leverage." Daniel's answering smile was wolfish, the kind of expression that would have sent lesser men running for the hills. "I might know a guy." The charity gala was a glittering spectacle of hollow smiles and sharper knives, the ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and the kind of wealth that could buy silence as easily as it bought loyalty. Luca had debated skipping until he saw the guest list. Elena and Daniel, listed together as Carter and Moretti Holdings. The rebrand was a slap in the face, a public declaration that she'd moved on and up while he floundered in the wreckage of his own making. He spotted them across the crowded room, Elena in a backless gown that showcased the phoenix tattoo between her shoulder blades, new ink, inked over scars he didn't recognize, a permanent reminder of her rebirth from the ashes of their marriage. Daniel's hand rested possessively at the small of her back as they worked the room, schmoozing with investors who'd abandoned Luca's sinking ship just last week, their laughter a private joke at his expense. Sophia appeared at his elbow like a specter, her usual bravado replaced by something sharper, more calculated. "She's winning," she murmured, her breath hot against his ear, the scent of her perfume, something expensive and floral, clashing with the bourbon on his tongue. Luca knocked back the rest of his drink, the alcohol doing nothing to dull the rage simmering in his veins. "Not yet." The auctioneer took the stage, his polished voice cutting through the din as he announced the next item. A week at the legendary Moretti Vineyard estate, generously donated by Elena Carter. The room erupted in murmurs, heads turning toward him with varying degrees of pity and schadenfreude. His vineyard. His family's legacy handed down through 3 generations of Morettis, now being auctioned off like common charity. Daniel placed the opening bid with a lazy raise of his paddle, his smirk visible even across the crowded room. Luca's vision tinted red at the edges, his fingers tightening around his empty glass. He raised his own paddle before he could stop himself. "Double." A hush fell over the crowd, the kind of anticipatory silence that precedes a car crash. Elena turned slowly, her green eyes locking onto his for the first time in months, and the smile she gave him was a blade wrapped in silk. She nodded slightly as if she'd expected this, as if she'd planned it. Daniel raised again, the numbers climbing into obscenity as the bidding war escalated, the crowd's murmurs growing louder with each volley. Back and forth they went, the sum reaching $500,000 before Luca finally slammed down his paddle with enough force to rattle the ice in nearby glasses. The crowd gasped, 100 phones surreptitiously recording the spectacle for later gossip. Elena leaned toward Daniel, whispering something that made him throw his head back in genuine laughter, the sound carrying across the suddenly silent room. Then she turned back to Luca and curtsied, a mocking little dip that brought the house down, her eyes never leaving his as she rubbed salt in the wound with elegant precision. The auctioneer beamed, oblivious to the undercurrents. Sold to Mr. Moretti. Only then, as the crowd's laughter followed him out of the ballroom, did Luca realize his mistake. He'd just paid a fortune for property he already owned, played perfectly into Elena's hands yet again. Sophia trailed behind him like a poorly trained poodle, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm of disapproval against the marble floors as the heavy doors swung shut on the sound of Elena's victory. Elena watched Luca's retreating back from the balcony, the night air cool against her bare shoulders as the sounds of the gala faded into background noise. Daniel joined her, handing her a fresh flute of champagne, Dom Perignon 96, the same vintage she'd sent Luca that first night in the restaurant, the opening move in this long game of chess. To new beginnings, he murmured, clinking his glass against hers, the crystal singing a clear, bright note in the quiet night. Elena took a sip, letting the bubbles dance across her tongue, the taste of victory sweeter than any vintage. Somewhere below, Luca was screaming at his driver, his empire reduced to ashes, his pride in tatters. And from those ashes? She smiled, turning her face toward the stars. She would rise. The study smelled of burning paper and betrayal, the acrid scent of Luca's financial records curling into ash as Elena fed another document to the flames. The firelight painted shifting patterns across Daniel's face as he stood sentinel by the mantel, his rolled-up sleeves revealing the faint white scars that crisscrossed his forearms, silent testaments to battles fought long before she'd entered his life. He swirled his bourbon absently, the ice cubes clinking like a countdown clock, his gaze never leaving the dancing flames. Meera won't stop with Sophia, he said, his voice rough with the weight of unspoken history. She's always been thorough, she'll come for you next. Elena didn't pause as she tossed another sheet into the fire, the paper blackening at the edges like a dying rose. Let her, she replied, the words cool and precise as a scalpel. The phoenix tattoo between her shoulder blades itched beneath her silk blouse, the fresh ink still tender, a permanent reminder of what she'd survived, of what she'd become. She'd spent too many years shrinking herself to fit the narrow confines of Luca's ego, sanding down her edges until she could slip unnoticed into the background of his life. No more. Daniel's phone buzzed sharply against the marble mantelpiece, the security alert lighting up the screen with grim finality. Unauthorized access detected at the downtown office. He turned it toward her without comment, the blue glow highlighting the hard set of his jaw. She's here. Elena's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the reflection of the flames dancing in her pupils like distant wildfires. The downtown office loomed dark and silent, the only illumination coming from the city skyline beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. 1,000 pinpricks of light that did little to pierce the shadows where Meera Carter moved like a wraith. Her gloved fingers trailed over Elena's meticulously organized desk, pausing at the framed photograph of Luca mid-laugh, his face frozen in a moment of genuine joy from years ago, before ambition had hollowed him out. Predictable, Meera murmured to the empty room, her voice dripping with disdain as she pried open the bottom drawer and extracted the flash drive taped beneath it. The metal felt cool against her palm, a tiny weapon heavy with promise. She'd barely pocketed it when the overhead lights blazed to life with surgical brightness, forcing her to blink against the sudden assault. Elena stood framed in the doorway, backlit like some avenging angel in a tailored white suit that seemed to glow against the darkened office behind her. Looking for this? She asked mildly, holding up an identical flash drive between two manicured fingers, her emerald ring catching the light with a malicious wink. Myra's smirk faltered for just an instant, long enough for Daniel to materialize from the shadows near the bookcase, his gun trained on her with lethal precision. "Hello, sister," he said, the words laced with a lifetime of betrayal. The office seemed to hold its breath around them, the air thick with decades of unspoken grievances and the faint ozone tang of impending violence. Luca's penthouse had become a mausoleum of broken glass and spilled liquor, the remnants of his temper tantrums littering the floor like shrapnel from an exploded life. Sophia found him on the balcony, his shirt hanging open to reveal the hollowed-out planes of his chest, his eyes bloodshot and wild as he stared at the city below, that glittering beast that had once been his kingdom. She stepped carefully around the shattered remnants of a Tiffany lamp, the glass crunching beneath her Louboutins as she approached him with the deliberate movements of someone approaching a wounded animal. "We can still win," she said, pressing the flash drive into his damp palm, her fingers lingering just a moment too long. Luca stared at the tiny device as if it might detonate, his throat working soundlessly. "Why help me?" he finally rasped, the words scraped raw from too much whiskey and not enough sleep. Sophia's smile was all teeth and no warmth, her crimson lips stretching over the words like a fresh wound. "Because I want her to watch you choose me." The night air carried the distant wail of sirens, a fitting soundtrack to their mutual destruction as Luca's fingers closed around the drive with something like desperation. The boardroom hummed with tension so thick it was nearly tactile, every executive holding their breath as Luca strode in with Sophia trailing behind him like a poorly trained attack dog. Elena and Daniel sat at the head of the table, their postures mirror images of calm control, though their eyes burned with the same cold fire. Luca slammed the flash drive onto the polished mahogany hard enough to make the water glasses tremble. "I call for a vote of no confidence," he announced, his voice cracking with barely restrained fury. "Daniel Carter is embezzling company funds and I have proof." The room erupted in murmurs, heads swiveling between them like spectators at a tennis match. Elena merely leaned forward, her manicured nails tapping a silent rhythm against the tabletop. "By all means," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "play it." The screen behind them flickered to life, but instead of the damning financial records Luca had promised, his own voice filled the room crisp and clear. "Just make her VP and I'll funnel the rest to the offshore accounts." Sophia made a sound like a deflating balloon, her face draining of color as the recording continued, laying bare every sordid detail of their scheme. Elena rose with the grace of a queen ascending her throne, her gaze never leaving Luca's ashen face. "The board has already voted," she said, the words final as a guillotine's fall. "You're done." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Luca's chair screeching backward as he stumbled to his feet, his empire crumbling around him like a sandcastle at high tide. Dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold as Elena stood on the balcony of her new penthouse, the city stretching endlessly below her feet. Daniel's arms encircled her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched the first light creep across the skyline. Her skyline now, every gleaming tower a testament to her victory. His breath was warm against her neck as he pressed a kiss to the phoenix inked between her shoulder blades. "What next?" he murmured, the words vibrating against her skin. Elena watched the city awaken below them, the streets beginning to pulse with life as another day began. Somewhere in that maze of steel and glass, Luca was picking through the wreckage of his life, but the thought brought her no joy, only a quiet satisfaction that justice, when it finally came, had been served at her hand. She leaned back into Daniel's embrace, her fingers lacing through his as the sun crested the horizon, painting them both in liquid gold. "We rise," she said, and for the first time in years, the words tasted like truth. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and stale regret, the heavy air thick with the whispers of spectators who had come to witness the final act of Luca Moretti's downfall. Elena sat in the front row, her back straight as a blade, her black Givenchy suit a deliberate contrast to the pallor of Luca's face as he stood before the judge. The once arroganto now looked hollowed out, his tailored suit hanging loosely on his frame, the gold wedding band still clinging stubbornly to his left hand despite the divorce being finalized weeks ago. Across the aisle, Sophia fidgeted in a too-tight blazer, her manicured fingers shredding a tissue to confetti as the prosecutor laid out charge after charge. Embezzlement, fraud, insider trading. The evidence Elena and Daniel had meticulously compiled played on courtroom screens, each document and recording a nail in Luca's professional coffin. When the judge pronounced the sentence, 15 years no parole, Luca's knees actually buckled, his lawyer catching him by the elbow to keep him upright. Elena didn't smile, didn't flinch, simply rose with quiet dignity as the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs, his wild eyes finding hers for one terrible moment before the doors swung shut behind him. Outside, the autumn sunlight was shockingly bright after the courtroom's gloom. Daniel waited by the car, his silhouette lean and dangerous against the black town car, his sunglasses hiding eyes that had seen too much. "It's done," Elena said as she slid into the leather seat beside him, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. Daniel didn't reply, just reached across the console to squeeze her hand, his thumb brushing over the emerald ring she'd moved to her right hand. A small but significant rebellion. The car pulled away from the curb just as Sophia exploded from the courthouse steps, her tear-streaked face contorted with rage as she screamed obscenities at the retreating vehicle, her designer heels catching on the pavement as she gave chase for a few futile steps before collapsing in a heap of ruined silk and shattered entitlement. Elena didn't look back. The penthouse was filled with golden afternoon light when they arrived, the floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the city Elena now owned in every way that mattered. Daniel poured 2 glasses of the 96 Dom Perignon, no longer a weapon, just wine, as Elena shrugged out of her jacket and walked to the balcony. The phoenix tattoo between her shoulder blades stretched with the movement, the vibrant colors fully healed now, every scar beneath it finally at peace. Daniel joined her, pressing a chilled flute into her hand before clinking his own against it. "To new beginnings," he murmured, his free hand coming to rest at the small of her back where Luca's used to, but with none of the possessiveness, only quiet certainty. Elena took a sip, letting the bubbles dance across her tongue as she gazed at the skyline. Somewhere beyond those gleaming towers, Meera Carter was likely plotting her next move, and Sophia was probably already seducing some other powerful fool, and Luca was beginning his long walk into obscurity. But here in this moment, with the sun warm on her face and Daniel's steady presence at her side, none of that mattered. Elena turned to face him fully, setting her glass aside to frame his face with her hands. Hands that had signed divorce papers and corporate takeovers with equal finality, hands that had been dismissed and underestimated for far too long. Daniel's breath caught as she rose on her toes to brush her lips against his, the kiss tasting of champagne and hard-won victory. When she pulled back, his smile was the most genuine thing she'd seen in years. "What now?" he asked, his voice rough with promise. Elena glanced over her shoulder at the city spread out before them, her empire now built from the ashes of betrayal, then back at the man who had stood by her when she had nothing left to offer but revenge. She smiled, slow and sure. "Whatever we want." The wind caught her hair as Daniel pulled her close. The last of Elena's ghosts finally laid to rest as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting them both in gold. Some stories ended in fire. Hers had risen from it. The end.